given the number of registration that we have got this time, which has crossed over 100, and we hope that most of them will be able to attend, but we are also live streaming it. Someone not attending this can watch our live stream. People come, get an introduction. And when Joseph asked us, that wanted to ask a bit about the background, we said, let's start at the very beginning. Because if you're talking of the Indian context, one hears these words, but often one is like, the blind person or the person who can't see or hear. We pick parts of it and talk about it. We don't have a view of the whole. So it is not possible to give the view of a whole in a single hour, but at least where do we stand? And Joseph is the best person to do that. So before I introduce Joseph, just to give the flow of the session, I will be handing it over to Joseph, and he will speak for some time. And at the end of it, we will also have question answer sessions. And if you have, he's open to discussion with the participants. And this is a hygiene checkpoint, that we will be giving out certificate of participation to all those who attend. And we had already mentioned in the form that to keep your name as you would like it in the participation certificate. If you have done that already, fantastic. In case you want to change it, write to us. Let us know latest by Monday. We will change the name and give you the participation certificate. So without much delay, I will introduce Joseph, though he needs none. Joseph has lived and worked internationally for more than 25 years. He's a frequent guest speaker and delivers workshops on intercultural education across the globe in academia and industry. He's the director of Japan Intercultural Institute and is a specially appointed professor at the GIC Center, Keio University, Tokyo. He also teaches in the MA TESOL program at Tsuda University, Tokyo. He's the host of the Deep Culture podcast and is widely published. I'll leave it there. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you so much, Dolon, for that kind introduction. And you raised a very difficult question. As you said, these words, intercultural communication, intercultural education, intercultural competence, we hear all of these terms, and it can be very difficult to kind of get clear in our heads. And not only because there are many terms wandering around, but because everyone's context is different. Every intercultural context is different. So we can't really ever answer this question of where to start. But I thought I would talk about a few basic ideas from the field of intercultural education and training. And as I do that, I have a personal favor. So that we can keep some sense of community among us today. If you are comfortable, would you please leave your video cameras on so that we can see each other? And this allows us to feel that we're participating in something together. And isn't that what we are here for? And also, I have to ask you, do you like theory or not? Now, some people love theory, some people hate theory. So if I ask you, do you love theory or do you hate theory? So 5 is I love theory, 1 is I hate theory. Where are you on the love and hate theory? Oh, look at this. We've got 1s, we've got 5s, we've got 3s.
3 in between.
So, if you are a 5, there are some concepts that you may like today. If you are 1, we have pictures on the PowerPoint slides as well. And let me say that the field of intercultural communication has many concepts, and it does have theory, and it does have abstraction. But the most important point is not how many theories you know. There are certain key insights, some basic insights which we really need to be a kind of starting point for actively working in this field. And I would like to talk about some of those today. And thank you to everyone whose camera is on, so I feel like I'm here with you today. So let me share my screen. And the title today is Intercultural Education and Training, How to Get Started. This is a big topic for 40 minutes. I overheard someone say, if you can navigate the diversity in India, you can navigate it anywhere in the world. So this is certainly a wonderful starting point for Indians who are interested in the field of intercultural communication. You have one of the richest, most diverse societies on the planet as a starting point for this exploration. So please, let's see that as a rich resource for us as we are learning about this field and applying it to the contexts that we are working in. And today I will be talking about 3 points. We'll ask a very basic question. What is intercultural communication? We'll take a brief look at who are the people who are working in this field and what kind of jobs are they doing. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about some basic insights, a tiny bit of theory, and we'll be answering 3 important questions that I hope at the end of this talk you will be able to answer as well. And we'll be talking a little bit about where we can go from here to learn more. So let's begin with this first question. What is intercultural communication? And the concept is on the top half of this slide, and the feeling is on the bottom half of this slide. So the concept is that intercultural communication is the study of human relations between people with different cultural backgrounds, and thus different ways of relating and seeing the world. And it seeks to deepen intercultural understanding. This is the concept. But what is the feeling of intercultural communication? It is the clash of normals. It is simply that what is normal for me may not be normal for you, because my background is different, the way I was raised is different. And because of that, because what is normal for me may not be normal for you, it's not always enough to have good intentions. That nice people may not get along because of this misunderstanding, that good intentions are not good enough. And this is because culture, sometimes called deep culture, operates at the level of the unconscious mind, and it shapes our experience in very subtle but powerful ways. And so fundamentally, the field of intercultural communication means to learn about this clash of normals, to learn about these different normals, and to learn about the pain points and why nice people may not get along and what we can do about that. So this is the starting point for what we're talking about today. I thought it might be good, since there are some people who like academic background and theoretical approaches, to just give a quick overview of the study of intercultural communication as an academic field. Now, of course, intercultural communication is not simply an academic field. It is something that people have been thinking about and writing about throughout all of history, as these quotes remind us. And of course, India has a deep tradition of questions of diversity and cooperation. So intercultural communication and learning has a deep historical heritage and tradition. But the academic study of intercultural communication really goes back to the end of the 19th century. And perhaps one beginning point is the definition of culture as it was defined by E.B. Tyler in 1871. And this idea that we need to define culture came about because at this time there was a debate about the nature of diversity, of human diversity, and this question of nature versus nurture. Because as I think you know, many people traditionally believed that cultural diversity that diversity in the world reflected physical differences, and they would talk about different races or talking about blood or skin color, that biology and behavior were closely related, that how we act depends on our body. But the reason that this idea of culture was so important and was in fact revolutionary in the 19th century was that these scholars were arguing that diversity was not a reflection of race or blood or skin color. Diversity was a reflection of learning, of culture, and did not reflect physical differences. So the idea that culture shapes us in deep ways is a deeply radical notion from the historical perspective. And we do not have to go back so far to see this. For example, at that time, let's imagine that we went to the World Exposition, Universal Exposition in Paris, France, in the year 1900. What would we see there? We would see all of the latest technology, canned food, movie cameras, and escalators. This was modern technology in 1900. But we would also see a human zoo. We would have seen a human zoo, because at this time, people believed that humans belonged to different categories in a similar way to the way that animals belonged to different physical categories. And this was the context for the study of culture. And people like Franz Boas, who is considered the father of the scientific study of culture, he was the founder of the field of anthropology at Harvard University. Or, for example, the work of Margaret Mead, who was a cultural anthropologist, who was teaching us that in order to understand humanity, we must understand human diversity. And to understand human diversity, we must understand culture and the way that culture shapes us and shapes our communities. So within this tradition of anthropology, of this radical notion that culture shapes us in deep ways, we have in 1959 the work of Edward Hall, who published the book, The Silent Language. This is often considered the starting point for the field of intercultural communication or intercultural studies. And Edward Hall said, culture hides more than it reveals. And strangely enough, what it hides most effectively from its own participants. And this is quite a radical notion, that culture is powerful precisely because we don't notice it. Culture is powerful precisely because we don't notice it. And that is the challenge of this field, to bring that which is felt but not noticed consciously into conscious attention. And we often hear the terms surface culture and deep culture, the idea that some cultural products are visible, like ceremonies or dress or behavior. But the field of intercultural communication is more focused on deep culture, the unconscious elements that shape who we are, that shape our values, that shape how we live. This is perhaps the first key insight for this field of intercultural education or intercultural communication, that we are not talking primarily about visible culture, about dress, about food. We're fundamentally talking about the way that culture shapes our mind and shapes into our interaction in ways that we are not aware of. Now, we have seen some of the historic roots of intercultural communication. Obviously, a lot has changed since 1959. And in particular, in the past 20 years or 30 years, there has been a revolution in our understanding, not so much of human beings, but in our understanding of the mind, our understanding of how the human mind works and our brain. And there is new bodies of research that focus on culture and how the mind works. And this is the area that is informing the work that I do. Research that's being done in cultural neuroscience, in cognitive neuroscience, cultural psychology, cognitive psychology, social psychology, neurolinguistics, and all of you people who said 5, believe me, if you want depth and detail and abstraction, there is a lot there. You can find some very deep abstraction and technical depth in these fields. And what are the questions that this research is trying to shed light on? Well, we are learning the ways in which our brains are shaped by culture and vice versa, how culture shapes our cognitive processes, our brains. We are learning how the unconscious mind works. And this is important because the unconscious mind is deeply influenced by the cultural patterns that we grow up with. We're also learning how culture influences our perception and our cognition. Our brain is not simply an information processing computer. Our brain, our mind is shaped by the environment that we grow up in. And we are learning how perception and cognition are shaped by this. We're also learning how language is related to cognition and culture. We often say that language and culture are closely connected, but we may not always be clear about what is that connection. But we are learning more about this connection. And also, where do biases and our feelings of right and wrong come from? And we are learning that bias is a very natural state for human beings. It is a natural part of how our mind works, but that does not mean that it's a desirable state. But if we want to overcome intercultural barriers, we need to understand bias. So this has been a very brief tour of the background of the field of intercultural communication. I've been giving you a lot of information in just a few minutes, so I'm going to pause and look at your faces and see how we're doing. Now just give me a little reaction so I see, are we doing okay? Are the fives okay? Are the ones okay? This is some background. And you don't need to know these things, but I want you to see that this field is very deep, and it's not enough to simply learn a few key concepts. There is more depth than we can imagine, because what we're really trying to understand is the functioning of the human mind and human interaction. And these things are profoundly complex. And so, yes, we need to have some basic insights, but we always need to face this complexity with a spirit of humility and learning as we can continue to dig deeper into these topics. So, shall we go on to the next one? Are we ready to go on to part 2? Okay, I got some thumbs up. Great. So let's take just a brief look. Some people, of course, we're very curious about the concrete details. What is this field of intercultural communication, and who is working in this field? What kind of work is there? What kind of specialists are there? And of course, this is a big topic, and we can't spend too much time on it. But I think we can divide the field of intercultural communication and education into 3 basic categories. And the first category is in the field of international business and industry. And there are many intercultural specialists working, and they're meeting the needs of international business and of industry. And the kinds of work that they are doing are the kinds of things that you can see on this slide. And this is a reminder that intercultural communication and education is always in some context. And so the first step for anyone who wants to be working in this area is, what is the context that you're interested in? What is the context that is meaningful for you, that you want to develop yourself in? So international business and industry is one area, but also education. There are educators who are focused on increasing intercultural understanding, including those who are involved in these areas. And of course, foreign language education. Foreign language education is a form of intercultural education. It is perhaps it is not perhaps, it is absolutely, for certainly, the most influential, the most widespread, and the most powerful form of intercultural learning. But there are also, of course, many other areas in education that are touching upon intercultural understanding. And the third area that we can talk about is research that is being carried out. And this is being carried out in a number of academic disciplines, including intercultural communication, intercultural management, which focuses more on business, also cultural and social psychology, cognitive psychology, cultural neuroscience. And one of the challenges is that because this field is informed by many different disciplines, it can be difficult to have a feeling that you really understand what the core is, because there are many different ways, many different approaches to this field. So if you sometimes may feel that, there's all this terminology, there's all this theory, don't worry. That's because it is working across so many disciplines. And as you become familiar with things, you start to see these patterns emerging. So this was just a moment, a brief look at the different areas that people are working in. So let's go on to the getting started part, which was which was in the title of this presentation. And I think to get started, the starting point, I think that there are 3 questions that it's important for anyone who is working in this field to be able to answer for themselves. If you are in a leadership, if you are a cultural bridge person, these are 3 areas that you need to be comfortable talking about, that you need to have some basic insight about. And we'll talk about each of these questions in turn. But the first one is, what is culture? And what we really mean is, what is the role of culture in everyday life? And let's think a bit about this question. And there's something that's somehow quite odd about this question of what is culture. And that is that many educators and trainers, they struggle if you say to someone, well, what is culture? And they will struggle to say, well, there are many definitions, or it's hard to define, or it's a vague concept. And many people struggle to answer this question of what is culture. But I'm fascinated by the fact that cultural neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists, those who study the brain and mind, they have a very straightforward understanding of culture. And they will tell you that they can define culture or describe culture in a single word. So here is your first challenge for today. And don't think you can just listen to me lecture without having to face some performance pressure. The question for you is, if you ask a cultural neuroscientist, what is culture? What is the word? What is the single word that they will give to answer this question? Now, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to look at the chat box now, because I want you to guess. What is your guess for what a cultural neuroscientist will say if you say, what is culture? And type your answer before you look at other answers. Don't be shy. Isn't this a lovely list? And the interesting thing when you look at this, now we had Lalita who says all of the above. So Lalita says all of the above, which means that's fine to say it's all of the above, but then what is the center point of this? What is the nexus point? What is the center point of all of these ideas? And I think that what a cultural neuroscientist might say is that at the center of all of these words which we are having here is that fundamentally, from the perspective of the brain, that culture is patterns. Now, what kind of patterns are these? Well, they are complex patterns. They're not simplistic patterns. They're not do's and don'ts. They're not cause and effect. They're complex patterns. Patterns of what? They're patterns of behavior. They're patterns of meaning. Where do we find those patterns? We find those patterns within us. You have cultural patterns within your mind. And you also have cultural patterns in the world around us. And precisely the fact when the patterns within you match the patterns outside of you, you don't notice. When the patterns, the cultural patterns within you match those outside of you, you don't notice. You are navigating, you are swimming in culture, and you don't need to notice it. So here is one picture of culture, but someone said, well, what does culture look like in India? So we have a different picture for this one. And when we say that cultural patterns are complex, this has now all of the fives, all of you fives, you need to think about this word complexity. All of the ones, you look at the picture. When we say cultural patterns are complex, we mean that they are created through interaction. That interaction creates shared understanding, shared expectations. So it allows us to judge what is normal in a community. So we do not have culture. We navigate culture as we interact with others. And this complexity exists at many different scales. At the small scale, the smallest scale of the family, or up to the largest scale of a nation. So these patterns are complex and they operate at different scales. And they're within us and they're without us. Understanding that culture is complex can help us avoid some very common confusions that happen when people talk about culture. What kind of confusions? Well, I'm sure you may have heard a conversation like this. Well, how is Japan? What are people like? Well, they're kind of shy. Well, I know a Japanese who isn't shy at all. Well, not all Japanese are shy, but in general. But that's just a stereotype. Each person is a unique individual. Well, of course they are, but often, they act shy. This is a common confusion when we talk about culture. This idea that because we're all unique individuals, that somehow this means that we're not cultural. And so this is the question. If you are not typical, does that mean that you do not share in a culture? Think about this for just a moment. You don't need to type anything. If you are not typical, does this mean you do not share in a culture? And the answer, and there is a correct answer, and the correct answer is no, this does not mean that you do not share in a culture, because culture does not control behavior. Culture doesn't make you do anything. Culture teaches you how to play the game, and you play the game in your own way. You navigate as an individual within these communities in your own way. So it is the game of life. Culture teaches us how to play the game of life, and how you play the game of life is up to you. But you know what is normal, what is not normal. You know what fits in, how to not fit in. So there is no contradiction between individual variation, how you play the game, and sharing culture, knowing how to play the game and knowing how to play. So this is something that we can learn from about this first question. What is culture and what is its role in everyday life? Let's see, how much time do I have left? Who is the timekeeper for me today? Shweta, how many minutes do I have left?
Shweta, you're in mute.
Sorry, yes, you still have about 14 minutes.
14 minutes, okay. Does everybody have 14 minutes of concentration left? Because we've got more stuff to go here, I'm pouring it into my computer. So we've got 13 minutes left to talk about these next points. So let's go back to this second question that we want to talk about today, the questions that you need to be able to answer. And that is, how can we understand or explain cultural difference? We need to be able to understand and explain cultural difference. So let's take a brief look at this question. And let's begin by the key insight here. The key insight is there are different ways to talk about cultural difference. They are not right or wrong, but some of them are simpler and some of them are more complex. So here is your critical thinking question. We have 3 different statements about cultural difference. Hi, I'm from Elbonia. He's one of those Elbonians. I'd like to find out the Elbonian perspective. Well, Elbonians are very direct communicators. Now, you know where Elbonia is, right? It's next to Shoulderstan. But the question that we're asking is, which of these statements about cultural difference are simpler and which ones are more complex? So please, in the chat window, rank them from simplistic to complex, simplistic to sophisticated. Which one is the simplest? And put the A, B, and C in that order. I've lost my chat window. There it is. Oh, we have some different answers here. So this is a very important ability for us to be able to analyze and think through what are the different ways that we can talk about cultural difference. And we have some different answers here. Let's look at these answers in terms of what they're representing. Person A is talking about culture as a state of being, as an essential quality. He's one of those Elbonians. Person C is talking about culture as something that you do. Albonians are very direct communicators. And person B is talking about culture as a way of seeing, as a way of looking at the world, as a way of making sense. And when we line these up, we can find that culture as an essential quality is, in fact, it may be a very deep way to talk about culture, but at the same time, it is a very simple way to talk about culture as an absolute quality, as a single thing, as a single fact. When we hear people say, for example, oh, he's one of those Elbonians, or I'm proud of my culture, that's who I am, that's who they are, that's who we are. This treats culture as something that rests within the individual as an absolute quality. And this is and notice that when you talk about your own culture this way, if you say, I'm proud of my culture, or I'm proud of my cultures, it sounds good. But if you talk about someone else in this way, and you say, oh, you're one of those Elbonians, oh, you're Bengali, oh, it doesn't sound so good. And this is because it is, in fact, a simplification. We also, though, talk about culture as the things that people do. We hear, oh, well, Germans are very direct communicators, or not all Italians talk with their hands. And this is the idea that culture influences behavior. And this treats culture as a kind of programming or of shared behavior. But it recognizes exceptions, that not every German is going to communicate in the same way. And because it recognizes exceptions, it is more complex than culture as being, which does not recognize exceptions so easily. And this is a kind of behaviorist approach to understanding culture. But we can also look at culture in terms of shared meaning of how we look at the world. That culture teaches us how to see the world. It gives us a viewpoint. So you might hear someone say, oh, it's important to see things from the local perspective. Or when I speak French, I put on my French cultural glasses. And this is the idea that human beings are cultural by nature, that our background shapes the way that we see the world. Now notice the difference here. Culture influences behavior, but we're all human. This is quite a different way to look at culture, to say that we are all human and that culture is somehow on the surface. This culture as shared meaning sees that human beings are cultural by nature, that to understand humanity, we need to understand the fundamentally cultural nature of humanity. And in that sense, there is no contradiction between nature and nurture. Human beings are fundamentally cultural beings. How could it be otherwise? How could it be otherwise? So we can put these together into this learning model where we see that there are different ways to talk about culture, being, doing, seeing. Now, what we are doing right now in this moment is at this fourth level of meta. We are comparing different ways to talk about cultural difference. And as educators or trainers, this is what we need to be able to do, to be able to look at different ways to understand and talk about cultural difference. And let me just say that you see these dots and diagrams up here. You see these networks. Well, this is because the idea that culture exists at different levels of complexity is part of new approaches to understanding cultural difference. That recently research in cultural difference is not just talking about values or preferences, but it is talking about the way that our mind works, cognition, identity. And I'll just give you a brief example. Think about your mother. Now, this is me in the brown jacket when I was at my maximum cute time. And this is my mother. But if you tell someone to think about their mother, and then you put them in an fMRI, brain scan machine, you get some interesting results. You'll see, for example, that when Chinese subjects think about their mothers, the part of their brain that is activated is the same as when they think of themselves. There is not a big internal distinction between self and mother. When American subjects think about their mothers, the part of their brain that is activated is the same as when they think of a stranger. Now, maybe the Chinese person says, don't you love your mother? And maybe the American says, come on, man, get a life, be independent. The point is that these differences are very deep within us, and we take them for granted. And these new approaches to cultural difference are teaching us about this complexity and diffuse nature of cultural difference. We have one more question that we have to talk about, and there is a bonus question if we have time. And the final question is, how do people gain intercultural understanding? Yes, so we have cultural difference, but how do we gain intercultural understanding? And we know that some people have more intercultural understanding than others. If you hear let's say the English tourist who comes and says, oh yeah, I understand the Indian culture, I went to Taj Mahal. We know this is not a sophisticated understanding of cultural difference. So I'm going to give you another critical thinking question. And this is, can you have a feeling for what is more simplistic understanding of cultural difference, cultural understanding, and a more sophisticated or more complex? So we have Milpo, Gilma, Juna, and Burke. Milpo says, oh, In order to understand foreign cultures, you need a critical understanding of different cultural worldviews. Gilma says, oh, in order to understand foreign cultures, you need the important facts and figures about that place. And Juna says, to understand a foreign culture, you have to learn to see things from the local perspective. And Burke says, in order to understand a foreign culture, you should learn some etiquette and cultural do's and don'ts. So please rank them, and you can just put M, G, J, and B, just to say from simple to complex. How would you rank these 4 statements? And we'll put that in the chat window. Now, this is fascinating. My goodness. This is fascinating. We have very similar answers. Why do we have similar answers? Why? How did you know? How did you know how to answer this question? You know because you have an intuitive understanding of these levels of intercultural understanding. You know this at the intuitive level. What you have not done is learn some theory or some models to make sense of this intuition. But you have this intuition inside of you already. And we can learn that, yes, these are different levels of complexity. That Gilma is talking about facts, which is a simple thing. That Burke is talking about rules, which is more complex than facts. And then Juna is talking about the worldview, the way to look at things. And Milpo really has a meta perspective. And we can see that these are these different levels of levels of intercultural understanding. What you're looking at here, this slide is called the developmental model of linguoculture learning. And we're not going to look at this in detail. I will just say that one of the reasons to learn about some theory or some basic ideas or some models is it helps us organize our thinking. It helps us take our intuition, our lived experience, and turn it into knowledge which we can use in the world. Shweta, you have your hand up.
Yes, I'm sorry. I just wanted to remind you we have 1 minute left before
Excellent.
we have to open up for audience questions.
Excellent. So the reason to learn something about theory is to help organize our thinking, to learn some models. And what I've tried to do today is to give you some basic models to do just this. I will just say for anyone who's interested in learning more, in taking a next step, think about the context that you want to focus on. Think about the cultural pain points that you can find in your context, and think about the intercultural goals that you want to focus on. And this is the starting point to think about how you can apply these ideas to your context. I will give you the quick bonus question. We did have the bonus question for language educators. What is the relationship between language and culture? And I will give you a 20-second lesson. And you can get that by learning the word linguoculture and the idea that linguistic meaning is a reflection of the shared experience of its speakers, and that our intuitive understanding of language is based on our experience, that we can understand the very direct relationship between language and culture, and that having this starting point can inform what we do in language education. There's so much more. Of course, this is 40 minutes. There are many resources that will be available to you. There is a special gift that is arranged through BACFI, a free PDF of one of my books, A Deep Culture Experience, A Beginner's Guide. You'll be able to get a copy of this. Also, an article of mine, Edward Hall, Ahead of His Time, and this for all of the fives. This is the article for you. Also, I work with the Japan Intercultural Institute. We have a newsletter. If you'd like to sign up for that, we'd be happy to keep you informed of what we're doing. Also, I am the host of the Deep Culture podcast, and Ishita also is a co-host. I really encourage you to take a look at that. Also, the Japan Intercultural Institute offers a masterclass, which a number of BACFI members have already taken part in. Wonderful to have them. You can also get a copy of this PowerPoint slides, and there are some scholarly sources for all of you fives who want to dive deeply into these topics. Wow, we've survived. I have dumped a lot of information on you in 42.5 minutes. I'm proud of the fact that I have only gone over a tiny bit. Shweta was so kind to keep me on track in a very gentle way. Thank you so much for this attention and for letting me share in this BACFI community.
That was really very, very good, Joseph. Thank you very, very much, because it shook even my mind, my aged mind. It shook me. And I have now, looking at it from a psychological, from a mental point of view, I've asked people to ask questions. So before that, I have a question, which I can straight away ask you. You see, what happens to people, especially in India? Now, so many people travel abroad, live abroad. For example, my children one lives in Singapore for the last 20 years and one in the US for the last 20 years. I have seen changes in their behavior, changes in maybe because of exposure or whatever. So when they come back and they have to, there are a lot of things which they are not able to adjust to in different degrees. So culture, what do you say? Your cultural values keep changing, your beliefs keep, undergoing change with time and exposure. So how do we address that?
So this is a fascinating question. And one way to think of this is that when we have a foreign experience, we are learning new patterns.
Yes.
Our mind is recognizing new patterns. And once we have recognized these new patterns, once we have seen these patterns, we cannot unsee them. So we go back home and we have these new patterns in our mind, a new point of comparison. And suddenly, where we didn't see patterns before, we have a new point of comparison. And this can be very difficult, even to come back and adjust to a society that you're so familiar with, simply because we have these new patterns that we cannot unsee. So, as you say, it is a profound challenge, but it's a source of richness too, isn't it?
Yes. No, but my question was not just that there is a change. When I'm actually training business employees in an IT organization on culture. Some of them have so much of exposure. Some of them don't have so much of exposure. Some of them takes a few things. Some of them take something else. So to address their queries and how do you handle it is what I was thinking. How do I teach them to handle it? Sorry, and that's all. I'm not going to ask any more questions. Please feel free to ask.
So I would simply say that in my work, I focus on the cultural learning process, that each of us has experienced what this process of learning about difference. Yes. And let us reflect upon our own process. And so it's really a reflection on the process of each individual. So as we help people understand this process that they're going through, each of them can then learn to navigate better for themselves.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. And that was very useful for me, especially. Anyone else? Any questions, please? I haven't seen any questions on the...
Well, I just want to warn people that I've lived in Japan for many years. And so I'm very comfortable with silence. And I hear that many Indians are not so comfortable with silence. But in Japan, I'm very comfortable with silence. So if there are no questions, that's fine. I can wait.
Mhm. Should we ask them to unmute and ask the question themselves if they are comfortable with that? Instead of
Absolutely, Lalita. I think you
I
can
think
do it that way as
I
well.
think you people can straight away ask the questions. Otherwise, yes, Sil,
Silke, yes.
please tell.
I have a question. First of all, Joseph, thank you so much. This was very, very inspiring. I learned many new things, and I revisited a lot of things that I knew in the past and I had forgotten. So this was perfect. As I mentioned earlier, I'm based in Germany. I teach at a university intercultural communication, and I had a little bit of a very intense conversation with my professor this week, and I would like your take on it. And the topic was that I used the word intercultural communication, intercultural competence. And her perspective is that the word is outdated, that we shouldn't use it anymore, that it even is connected to colonialism, and that it's an absolute no-go to use the word. And I can see her perspective, obviously. Yes, it's being debated quite a bit also in research. Should we use it or not? With the idea of cultures being containers and speaking about, national cultures rather than cultural context. Still, I don't see why I shouldn't really use the word if I use it in the right way. So this is a very specific question. I'm aware of that, but I have an expert here, and this conversation I had with my professor really, really stayed with me all week. And I would really like your take on it, because you use the word as well, which I would also use it, but maybe you can share your thoughts on that.
I have heard people give a similar opinion. And there is a certain, I think, particularly in Europe and maybe North America, there is a kind of social justice strand of people working in this field. Now, my feeling is that activism is different than education. Education tries to understand what is. Activism tries to change what is. And I'm interested in understanding what is. So I am not part of this social justice strand. I think that's a separate thing. But there are many people who have this idea that there is a very political view of these questions. I think that the idea that culture is an outdated idea, I think that idea is outdated. That if you look, as I said, ask a cultural neuroscientist, and they will not say that culture cannot be defined. We are starting to understand how these things, but it is complex. Because it's complex, it cannot be boiled down to an essential quality. And what much of this criticism is to say, well, you can't say that one country is one culture. Of course not, because culture is complex. No one is saying that there is one culture, one country. So there is a kind of false disagreement here. So good luck navigating those conversations. They can be difficult because people have some very strong feelings about them, but don't lose heart. Think about complexity theory. Complexity theory is what helps me.
Thank you very much. And you're spot on with that, because this conversation to me came out of nowhere. I really hurt her feelings personally, which really had not been my intention at all. And the interesting thing is, our program, the bachelor program we teach in, is called Intercultural Communication. So it got to a point where she questions the name of our program, like, oh, listen, this is not going in the right direction. So thank you very much for your thoughts.
Well, and the final word is, there's an irony that she has trouble with having a diverse viewpoint about this word, that she needs to make a categorical statement that this is not okay, which is not diversity. Diversity means that it's okay to be different. That is the nature. That is different normals. It is exactly what we're talking about. So thank you so much. What a wonderful question.
There's a question from Samir. He says, how complex is it, that is difficult or challenging, to analyze non-verbal cues in intercultural communicative competence? This is especially after you spoke about silence. Now, how do we interpret or analyze, or how do we teach people to analyze non-verbal cues?
So
especially when they're living in a different country.
So complexity is difficult because it's very difficult to measure. Complex phenomenon are difficult to measure, which is why we cannot predict the weather. So if you try to do research about nonverbal cues and you try to categorize or catalog them, you develop this very complex, abstract construction. But the human mind deals with complexity intuitively, not analytically. We learn to read patterns. So if we're working as educators, then the goal is not to create taxonomies. The goal is to help us develop intuitive understanding, the ability to learn new patterns. It's the process of learning that's important, not the specific cue itself. You don't need the taxonomy, you need the process of learning. But this is a big issue with research. Intercultural research can seem very complex. Okay, I'll give you my bias. Don't tell anyone I said this. A lot of intercultural research is very abstract and very shallow. It is big words to talk about very shallow insights. And you read it and you say, what have I learned? And that's because if you try to take something complex and turn it into concepts, you end up with abstraction, but it doesn't give you insight. So the key to being an intercultural educator is to have insight, not to have concepts.
That's what, Samir, your answer is that you don't analyze. You intuitively learn. Whenever, and that's what we need to teach, that you can't analyze and say this is the right thing. I think that was wonderful. Thank you. I don't think we have any time for more questions. So I would just request the participants to fill in the feedback form. The link is given in the chat box. And over to Dolo.
Okay, thank you, Lalita.
Thank you, Joseph. Once again, I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you very, very much, personally.
It was absolutely fascinating. And after hearing you today, I thought to myself, I shall never conduct any webinar on anything intercultural in the future, because I will never manage to even reach half the level of where you are. So that's your effect.
Then I have failed, haven't I?
Okay, but thank you very much. There are a few announcements I wanted to make today. That is not exactly related to the webinar today. It is some announcements about BEC-FI, that we have revamped our website, and we'll be putting the link of the website into the chat box. I had just typed it somewhere, but I don't know where it's gone now. And so do take a look at our new website. Those who are members, see, if you like it, let us know. And those who are not members today, look at the website. You have a link to join us as members. If you feel that these interests align with your interests, do join us, because as members, you will have information about all our events over email. We do post on social media as well, but for our members, we give direct information. And apart from the website, what we wanted to share is that for our members, we also have these one-on-one sessions. You could call them mentoring. Anything you want to discuss career growth, you can book a call with us. You want to put in an application for an international conference, and you would like someone to guide you through the application process. We have done that in our past, and we are very proud to say that our members have been winning scholarships. So if you would like to do that. And also we share, that is with our members, we share information about international conferences, national conferences, job opportunities within India. And we do share all that. So if it aligns with your interests, we'd be very happy to have you as members. And the final and the most important thing, given the response to today's webinar, with the registration process, as well as today, we were expecting it, of course, today. What we felt was that this just cannot be a one-off event that we've organized and we just move on doing different themes in business communication. We will, of course, keep addressing different areas of business communication, but this is one area that we want to go deep into. So as a first step, we have prepared a survey. It is a collection of data because that is something that is lacking about India. There is very little data that is available from India. It is more the outside view. There is no inside view. So that is what BEC5 wants to do. So we'll be sharing that survey link. Do fill in the survey, as well as share it with anyone you think who is in this field of communication, of training, of languages. Doesn't have to be English. It could be foreign languages in India, but we want data about India. And share it, talk about it, because based on the findings of the survey, we would like to plan out our next series of activities because we see tremendous potential over here. That series of activities could be webinars, could be workshops. We don't have any idea what they will be. We will see, analyze the surveys, and then go ahead with the next steps. And of course, you will all receive information over mails as well as on social media. So we will end. We are 2 minutes over time. We will end. And thank you to all the participants for your wonderful participation today. And thank you, Joseph. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for this time.